Alrighty. Well, how is everyone today? I suppose we have, maybe some business to take care of regarding our final project. I have our final project narrowed down somewhat. I have not worked on it since Tuesday's class. So let's see what's going on here. But I'm hoping that we can at least extract some pedagogical value from conducting something like a mock hearing on the ongoing installations, the ongoing military installations in the lower Snake River. And as far as I have been able to reconstruct how some sort of challenge to the ongoing existence of those military installations would go, it would have to be, unless we have a major revolution and change our system of government dramatically, there would have to be a hearing in front of the Congress, probably a hearing in front of the House of Representatives, and then a hearing in front of the Senate. And I decided to go ahead and just call what we're doing a mock hearing on a mock Senate hearing on Lower Snake Dam removal. And there are two policy options before us, okay, in our hearing. And there'll be expert witnesses summoned to testify on both policy options, okay, on the pros and cons, right, of each policy option. The first policy option, of course, is business as usual. And that would be just basically maximize the Snake River's hydropower resources, okay? Fully instrumentalize the Snake River's water resources in order to maximize hydroelectricity production from the Snake River, from the Columbia Snake River watershed, right? And that makes a lot of sense in an era of anthropogenic climate destabilization, where we know that the primary contributing factor to anthropogenic climate destabilization is a variety of greenhouse gas emissions that are primarily the result of extracting and consuming, burning greenhouse fossil fuels, right? And so, the idea is that with policy option one, if we continue maximizing the hydropower resources of the Snake River, then we will stand the greatest chance of reducing the consequences of catastrophic climate change, right? Or what I prefer to call anthropogenic climate destabilization, right? Because the Snake River dams represent clean energy, right? So the proposal to eliminate those Snake River dams would have perhaps a detrimental effect on our responses to anthropogenic climate destabilization. In any event, that's the sort of thing I want those who consider policy option, those who have signed up to defend policy option one. I'm hoping that you're thinking very seriously about this sort of argument, okay? Because I hope we have time today I hope we have considerable time today to spend on this sort of argument. All right, the argument that was presented exactly a week ago, namely that maximization, right? This is the normative claim that was presented last Thursday, all right? Maximization of Snake River water resources is a necessary and indispensable component of our global response to anthropogenic climate destabilization, right? because the Snake River dams represent so-called clean, non-greenhouse gas emitting forms of power generation. And so the long and short is we need to sacrifice our Snake River salmon populations because we need to maximize Snake River water resources for the sake of reducing human greenhouse gas emissions, right? That's the argument. I want to get there eventually today, okay? But that's only one part, okay? Now let's since I've got this up on the screen right now, let's consider a little more about. So this is how I envision it. All right, Thursday, June 9th, and it turns out that I was fairly accurate. There are about 45 students signed up for this class right now, currently enrolled, who are expecting some sort of credit for this class. And about 15 of you have opted to do a written final exam option instead of this model hearing, okay? So that leaves about 30 of you. I sent out something on Tuesday morning, I believe, that a breakdown of names of who is involved, you know, Team 1 and Team 2. And I have not done anything since then. I intend to do more on that over the weekend, and I intend to send out more information about that as I break it down more over the weekend. All right, but basically, your environmental community, which stands for the normative claim, Northwest societies have an obligation to rewild the lower Snake River, okay, and adopt policy option 2. Those people who, and this is, you know, Team 2 corresponds to those who advocate policy option 2, are broken down into anthropocentric environmentalists and more than anthropocentric environmentalists. Okay, so anyway, that's kind of where we're going, and I think we should just, since I have not done any work in putting more of this together, we'll talk more about this on Tuesday, okay? Anybody has any questions? So far, everybody should have committed, okay? If you have not decided, if you have not sent me an email that you intend to do the written take-home final exam, okay, then you should be signed up for either Team 1 or Team 2, okay? And since Team 1 is pretty much full, okay, Team 1 is the ad hoc team of Group A conservationists and various utility beneficiaries of the way that we do business as usual, right? Mainstream resource extractivism is typically justified by an alliance between, an alliance of arguments between Group A conservationists and wise users, as I say, and a whole group of practical groups, right, political interests who have a vested stake in business as usual, right? The barge navigators have a great deal of influence over Columbia Basin, over what we do to Snake River watershed, Snake River water resources, right? Anyway, so if you have not signed up yet, then you should have signed up, okay? And so far we have room available, just off the top of my head. We have certainly more than, if you have not signed up yet, to play a role. You don't want to do a written final exam. You want to participate in the group project. Where you're going to end up finding a home is somewhere probably in here, okay? So talk to me after class if you find yourself in that situation, all right? and we'll fit you in somewhere here among the more than anthropocentric environmentalist camp, defending policy option 2. All right, defending removal of the 4 lower snake dams. All right, but I'd like to get more in depth, and I feel like we made progress. You know, I feel like exactly a week ago, a provocative question was asked, and I'm not sure if all the implications, you know, were contained, you know, by the person who asked that question, but I went ahead and filled those in, and so at some point today, and I think really we're going to start today's class by talking about that, because it's among the first slide that we look at today. I think that's pretty much where we left off. We talked about Murray Bookchin's normative theory and the larger normative claim, larger argument that Murray Bookchin. Those of you who you know, were suspicious of Murray Bookchin's perhaps committing the naturalistic fallacy, you're on track there. I know that some students always kind of wonder about Murray Bookchin, because we kind of end up with this familiar. I encourage all my students to reject the use of nature, of the natural as a normative guideline. And this goes back to Leopold, really. You know, some people are surprised that Leopold, that I encourage students not to think of Leopold as just saying, follow nature. One slide. In any event, there is perhaps a legitimate suspicion that Murray Bookchin commits something like a naturalistic fallacy, and perhaps that suspicion can also be applied to our older friend Holmes Ralston, because both of them seem to be suggesting that evolutionary history is teleological, right? And the Darwinists kind of drove that idea out of the academy, right? I mean, right? And that was kind of the Darwinist response to the natural law theorists, right? The natural law theorists insist on reading evolutionary history and the emergence of humankind as teleological, right? Remember the wise users who want to celebrate the emergence of the human animal as the flowering of evolutionary history, right? The flowering of the telos of the design of why all these species were created, right? Here we are, these wonderful human animals. And so when we read an interpretation like Bookchin's, which reads teleology again back into evolutionary history, we might be a little bit suspicious, right? And the same thing when we encountered Holmes Ralston, we might be a little suspicious of both Bookchin and Ralston and their tendency to read teleological tendencies into evolutionary history, right? The Darwinists routed the teleologists by arguing that there's nothing purpose-driven in evolutionary history. It's just random adaptation of the fittest, right? And so now we find Bookchin perhaps taking an even larger view and arguing that overall, and I like to remind students that this is really kind of Ralston's view too, of the overall trajectory of evolutionary history, taking the broad view and trying to kind of discern larger patterns in the emergence of life on Earth, right? And the evolution of life on Earth, these tendencies are present, okay? These tendencies, when you review the story as a whole, you see these tendencies are evident, right? Both Ralston and Bookchin are making these kinds of claims, right? And because these tendencies are evident in natural history, they provide us with a norm, right? A norm for critiquing human interaction with natural resources. those human interactions with natural resources which encourage all of these kinds of tendencies are good, right? Whereas those human interactions, those human managements of natural resources which discourage, right, which suppress these kinds of tendencies are bad, okay? And that's Bookchin's larger point, right? That's how we know how to choose as a natural resource management. As natural resource managers, we are obligated to protect existing biodiversity, right? And all that it requires, including healthy, clean land, air, water, wildlife. And we are obligated, where possible, to restore previously damaged wildlife habitats, and perhaps even to go so far as to create or open up entirely new wildlife habitats that nature had provided for before. All right. So this is kind of a stark, I don't know why, I think this is progress to have crystallized our reason, and this is far, far, far ahead of where anybody who actually has natural resource management authority over Snake River watershed resources has thought, right? This is way ahead of, I think anyway. I mean, but I think this is what we need perhaps to be thinking about, okay? And I told you guys on Tuesday that if somebody was to do a good job of writing this up, and by writing it up, I mean, look, there are a number of different answers to this question, right? The moral struggle is, should we fully instrumentalize Snake River water resources for the sake of preventing irreversible harm to Earth's climate system? All right? So in the major leagues, perhaps, of natural resource management in the Pacific Northwest, perhaps we need to think about this big conflict between Snake River salmon, Snake River, the integrity of the Snake River Basin, and the integrity, right? One ecological whole, Snake River salmon ecosystem, right? Versus another ecological whole, Earth's climate systems, okay? Are we prepared? I think perhaps much of the work that we've done all term prepares us to consider, right? These are two kind of ultimate, if you will, right? One is larger than the other and more comprehensive, right? Arguably, the Snake River salmon ecosystem is nested within, right? And the larger comprehensive system is Earth's climate systems, right? And the argument is that because Earth's climate systems are more important, right? More comprehensive, greater, well, then if push comes to shove, we need to consider, seriously consider, sacrificing Snake River salmon ecosystems. Because that's what's involved when we totally instrumentalize, right? Which we need to do. The argument says we need to totally instrumentalize all the falling water, right? All the falling water of the Snake River and all of its sub-basins needs to be instrumentalized in order to maximize the power generation that we receive from the Snake River water resources that's clean, right? It's clean energy, right? Right? That's the argument. You guys are familiar with that. We've talked enough about this, right? So, and so now let's consider today. And then eventually we'll get to David Watson's essay on the mega machine, the technological mega machine. But I want to start with considering this argument, okay? Because it's a big showdown between one ecological whole and another ecological whole, okay? And so we need to ask ourselves, what to start with? What would a neo-Kantian, right? A non-consequentialist. Remember, I scaled down my ambitions for this class just to the expectation that my students understand and take seriously the non-consequentialist moral philosophical point of view. Because we are so ingrained in consequentialism, in whatever we do, it has to be morally right because it produces a certain outcome, right? And there's no other determination of morally right other than outcome. I want to steer my students away from that whole way of thinking. Stop being consequentialist. Stop thinking about morally right in terms of outcome. All right? Now I know that's painful, and how painful that is may be evident, may begin to be evident. Okay? But I want to start thinking in terms of, remember, Tom Regan's, the stringent interpretation of Tom Regan's argument that says that even if we could harvest an anthropocentric good from the chimpanzee's heart, right? Even though it's good for human beings, the moral test is non-instrumentalization of that which has moral status. Okay? So, if the Snake River has moral status, and we adopt that stringent Tom Regan deontological, right? That stringent deontological test of moral right and moral wrong, then perhaps we have to conclude that total instrumentalization of Snake River water resources, even though, right? Anyway, that's I'm racing way ahead of myself as I tend to do. So let's slow down a little bit. All right. But I'm hoping that perhaps some of today's, what I have to share today, will influence our both sides, really. I mean, the argument I'm hoping we can discuss today is certainly a key part of the pro-dam point of view, right, for our final project. That group who intends to defend the normative claim, we need to keep all the dams in place, right? We are morally obligated to keep all the dams in place. Probably that group needs to address this question that we'll try to break open today, okay? Of, this question, right? I mean, this is part of what they're saying, it seems to me, right? Part of a defense of the lower Snake River dams is that we need to maximize clean hydropower, right? Clean electricity in order to ward off the worst possible consequences of this larger pattern, right, that we're all subjected to, anthropogenic climate destabilization, right? So to ward off anthropogenic climate destabilization, we need to treat all of the water resources of the Snake River Basin as a sacrifice zone, right? That's kind of what the argument, right? That's the claim, all right? So let's consider that today, and I don't know. I don't have an answer. I really don't. Okay. It seems illustrative, though, and it seems that consequentialists, as I point out here in this page of notes, consequentialists probably are not going to have too much trouble. Certainly anthropocentric, all mainstream, right? All resource managers who think that we ought to, right? And this is a very sympathetic point of view, right? It's hard to disagree with this. We ought to organize our natural resource policies around consequences for human beings. Well, many of, if we accept that point of view, the argument, yes, is hard to resist. It's really hard to resist. Okay? Our Snake River water resources have to go by the boards. We need to harvest as many kilowatts as possible, right? to hell with the salmon. Okay, right? That's what this argument says. This argument represents essentially what I understand. Our community member last week, whose name I don't know because I'm terrible with names, and I remember I need glasses too, so if that community member is sitting way back there, not only am I bad with names, but I'm bad with faces too, anyway. But that person's probably here because I think that person probably wasn't here on Tuesday, so anyway, that's what that person was saying, that community member was saying, and it's a compelling argument. It really is. Right? If we accept the consequentialist normative orientation, right? And we accept, at least strategically, the idea that anthropocentrism is the way to go, okay? So we've got anthropocentrism, consequentialism. Sounds like, it's kind of hard to argue. If it's true, we never know. I mean, maybe all this anthropogenic climate destabilization is just a bunch of hogwash and it's not really happening at all, right? But if it is happening, then perhaps we ought to consider seriously the idea, look, what's going to happen if we take out the 4 lower snake dams? What's going to happen? It means we're going to have to replace, right? So the argument goes. We're going to have to replace that lost power generation, which is clean power generation, with some sort of dirty power generation, which is going to contribute to greenhouse gases, right? That's the terrible things, right? So the consequentialists, wow, man, those guys have a really good argument, don't they? Okay? So anyway, but let's keep in mind, though, that some, and the ones that I want to worry about today are some non-consequentialists might also argue yes, okay? Some ecologically minded natural law theorists, okay, we don't care about them, right? But that's actually an instructive point. Under the doctrine of double effect, which goes back to Thomas of Aquinas, roughly 1250, 1260 AD. Okay, pre-Enlightenment, right? The natural law arguments are all pre-Enlightenment. They all go back to Thomas Aquinas. Anyway, Thomas Aquinas bequeathed to us this doctrine of double effect. And if we were to accept the idea that sacrificing the ecological whole of Snake River salmon runs is a grave moral harm. Okay? Let's accept that for the time being. All right? Sacrificing Snake River salmon runs is a grave moral wrong. Okay? Now, under the doctrine of double effect, a grave moral wrong is justifiable if it is done with the intention of avoiding a different grave moral wrong. Okay? So the classic example is abortion. All right? In instances where the pregnant woman's life is at risk, right? Her very life is at risk, then under the doctrine of double effect, an abortion is morally justifiable, okay? Provided that the abortion, the doctor committing, or the woman herself, pregnant woman herself committing the abortion, is doing it with the intention, right? And that's what's key under the doctrine of double effect, with the intention of avoiding a second grave moral harm. All right. So the second grave moral harm in the case of abortion would be, for example, if a woman has uterine cancer, right? Some severe illness, whereby her continuing her pregnancy would result in her death, right? As long as her physician is administering, for example, an abortifacient drug, right? Something to induce abortion. As long as he's doing that with the intention of saving her life, then the secondary, under the doctrine of double effect, the secondary result of causing an abortion, killing a fetus, is okay, right? It's not okay, it's not just okay, but it's the right thing to do, right? So we could try as natural law theorists, and that's actually kind of a logical move, really. You know, natural law theorists, if they're going to justify, if, you know, when they think about, right, when a natural law theorist thinks about this question, they're going to think about the doctrine of double effect, and they're going to think about, you know, well, maybe it's maybe it's morally necessary to sacrifice, right, Snake River water resources and Snake River salmon in order to avoid another grave moral wrong, right? The other grave moral wrong is the catastrophic anthropogenic climate destabilization, right? And the whole disintegration of Earth's climate systems, and then runaway, right? Everything, and, you know, it's all over, right? So that's obviously a moral wrong, and so, okay, there we go. Under natural law theory, we have an obligation, right? If we're willing to accept that ecological wholes have the kind of moral status that human beings do, then under the doctrine of double effect, we have an obligation to do as our community members suggested last week, right? And to sacrifice, to treat our Snake River salmon resources as a sacrifice zone in order to protect the overall and larger, more comprehensive interests of Earth's climate systems, right? Okay? So some consequentialists, right? So far that's all I've talked about. But now I want to consider what a non-consequentialist might argue. Some non-consequentialists might also argue, might also agree that it is morally right to sacrifice Snake River salmon resources for the sake of Earth's climate systems, right? Okay? Some neo-Kantians might argue that if total instrumentalization of Snake River water resources is necessary to preserve Earth's climate systems, then we ought to go ahead and do that. All right? And those neo-Kantians who argue, who want, you know, who are inclined to argue that the larger interests of the ecological whole of Earth's climate systems, the more comprehensive set of interests prevails, right? Those thinkers might well want to recall Tom Regan's lifeboat example.